Okay, so all of you attended, many of you attended the first session around Jira Essentials. And in the first session, we discussed about how to set up Jira. So things that we discussed were around these concepts. So how many of you refreshing your memory and looking, this looks familiar? We started with this, eventually looked at field configurations. Some things might seem a bit hazy now, but you can always go back. We still have the presentation, so you can go back and refresh. But essentially, we discussed issue types. We discussed about workflows, which is key. I've seen some people already implementing it, which is great. So some people are already putting this into practice. So today what we'll discuss is sort of building on top of this with the knowledge of workflows and what different issue types are. We're going to discuss about how do we plan our work now. This is something which a lot of you have already been more familiar with, so it might seem more familiar territory than workflow, which we discussed last time. But for people who are starting out, Gautami, Subhash, and Shubham, sorry, and people who haven't used Jira a lot, so for them it's probably useful to understand, and even for frequent users, there are a few things here in today's session that you guys can benefit from and understand how to use it better. So we'll get started. If any questions, feel free to stop me, and then we can discuss them as we go along. So the format of today's session is basically going through the story, the life of a story, right? So how do we really so just putting in context, like how does a project really start and how do we break it down and how do we start using Jira to effectively manage the delivery of these stories, right? So typically when when we have a project, it comes to us as a concept, as it could be in a requirement document, it could be in a very broad statement, like I want to build a new product or a small feature. It could be documented in any forms, but it's not something which we can immediately action. So what we do is we start breaking it down into stories. That's the first port of call. So okay, what stories does it entail? How many stories? So we try and break it down in as grand a manner as possible. What I'll also share with you in this session is some best practices, a few best practices. So I'll keep highlighting them as we come across concepts which require them. So stories, for example, they typically take a format of as a type of user. I would like to do something so that I can achieve some business value. So typically, you should always keep that in mind as a general format for a story. Whenever somebody tells you that I want to build um, let's say a gaming engine or maybe a transaction platform. So then tell me all the user stories. As a user, what would I do as an admin? What would I do and why would I do that? Why is important? Maybe you may not document it, but it's important for you to understand what's the business value being delivered because that helps you prioritize things relative to each other. So that's a general format. So what you do is you start putting down stories, you start creating, and this set of stories that you end up creating is typically what we call a backlog. And then you start grouping them around epics. So epics could be, epics are basically grouping of stories based on a common theme. So for example, as a user, I should be able to create a new account. As a user, I should be able to log in. As a user, I should be able to retrieve my password. So those are all related to user registration or bringing a user into the system. So typically we create epics around these broader themes, right? And so epics could also be larger stories. So some things you have not explored yet. Let's say, for example, if you are creating an online booking engine or online travel site, so you could have a broad epic called ability to book hotels. Now there are lots of user stories within that. There are lots of features, lots of activities that you could do as part of that. But you could just leave that epic and then come to it later and then break it down into stories or create stories in that epic. So that's the different ways in which we start sort of breaking down our features and tasks, right? And then from epics, we look at versions. Now, versions are typically set of stories or epics that we expect to deliver within a certain time frame. And these are typically also synonymous to releases. So we say we're going to have our MVP, a minimum viable product, which will comprise of 4 set of epics and a few other stories and tasks maybe. and this is what we'll call our MVP. Now, as we go along, we might reduce some stories, add a few stories, but effectively that version remains the same. So these few stories and epics might come out of this or go into this, but we kind of start creating versions of what we need to release as chunks, and these are typically to the live sites, right? So, so clear with this concept. One other best practice that I would also like to suggest in stories: when you write stories, don't think about implementation concerns. So this is a common thing that we do. Like for example, when we write a story like, I should be able to press a login button to log into the account. Now that's something where you're already defining how that UI should look like and how there should be a button. Now that restricts you from thinking creatively on how better you could log in. Effectively, what you want to do is, as a user, I should be able to as a registered user, I should be able to access the areas of the platform which are privileged, which only I have the privilege to. Right? That's effectively what you want to do. So try and keep your stories as abstract as possible, and implementation level details should be in the description, so that gives you a sort of flexibility to think creatively about what are better ways to achieve that feature. So that's just one of the best practice to keep in mind. So everybody clear till here? Simple. Yeah.
Difference between story and task.
Yeah, so story is typically something which delivers business value. So anything that which actually is something which you roll out and a user can actually experience that business value. And task is something like setting up the servers. Now that's not something that has to be done, but it may not deliver any real business value in terms of what the requirements are. So now that task is different from a non-functional requirement as well, right? So when you create a story, you say, for example, that as a person new to this platform, I should be able to get to know more about the platform by landing on the site or landing on the platform. Now that's basically a story which tells you to create a home page, which gives you more information. A non-functional requirement is something like the page load speed should be less than 2 seconds. Okay, that's a non-functional. It's not something you will see. It's not something which you can see in the sort of UI or something, but it's a non-functional requirement that you have to adhere to. It's a system requirement so that's not a task, but it's a non-functional requirement of a story. A subtask could be that set up AWS servers, for example, or you could also use subtasks. So there's no, and again, this is not something that I'm suggesting as a rule or as a guide. So you can also break down stories into subtasks if you want. You could use it that way as well. There is flexibility around how you use it. So there is no particular guideline around how you use subtasks. But for example, if two people are working on a story, you could have even the story broken down into subtasks, saying, okay, for a particular story, I need to create a method which does this, and then the other person needs to create another class which does something else. So those could be subtasks. So they kind of keep getting complete, which is why subtasks are also not estimated generally. It's a story level estimate that you generally do. So that's how you can sort of look at this. Okay. So a quick sort of breakdown of how a story looks like in Jira. So we also have I'll actually take it. So we have also got a test project that I've set up. We'll do some practical work on this as we go along. So this is these are typically how it looks like in Jira. So you have a set of stories that you can see here that I've created already, and this is a story view. When I open this story view, what you see in this slide is what will appear, right? So so this is the same story, but now what we'll do is quickly, like for example, let's say if we have to make all of these stories a part of the same epic, so we can select all of them, and all we need to do is just drag them into the epic, and that's how you can assign an epic to, right? So you can see the epic appears here. I'm just telling you quick tricks also to use Jira effectively in terms of, so when you are inside an epic and you're looking at all the stories and you create an issue, it automatically will create it for that epic. So that's another quick trick to create. How many of you are familiar with this view? Just quick check. Yeah. Okay. Okay, got me not much, but so you'll see that this is basically how it looks, how Jira looks. So for Asha, we'll take you through more specific details. But so now what you can do is now you've got this, all of these stories. You can also now similar way you can drag them and you can assign them to a version. Right? So then you'll see a version also appearing. So that's how you play around with the fix and versions. Okay, now key components of a story. When you open a detailed view of a story, this is how it looks. So you have a title, like basically the story. As an unregistered user, I should be able to register myself on the app so that I can use the features meant for registered users. So this is, for example, how the story should look like. I'll quickly walk you through some of the description. This is where all of the details around, clarifications, requirements, wireframes, UI artifacts, most of this should be linked so that it gives a very clear view of what this story does. Actively use this comments feature because we tend to forget. So make sure that you are writing comments here whenever you have a question around a story. You may discuss it offline, but make sure you log a comment there so that you can trace the history, and if somebody else is working on that story, they have a full log of what. Assignee is the person who's going to work on a story. Best practice is not to put an assignee until it is moving to in progress, right? Because what happens is you may work on it, you may not work on it. I often see stories in backlogs or in Jira where people have already assigned tasks. So whenever you're moving it back, unassign it. You can also create an automation script for it, just like we discussed in the last. You can have a post function where if something moves to do, assignee should be removed. So that's a good way to keep that in check. This is the statuses. Last time we discussed workflows. So this is the status. You can just drop down and change it. Story points. So story points are the way we estimate stories. Typically, it's in time estimates or in complexity estimates. We'll cover that in a separate section. But this is one of the key metrics based on which Jira actually prepares its reports. Other things, create subtasks. So as I said, you can start creating subtasks within stories, and you can divide work within you. You can link issues. Link issue allows you to create dependent stories. So for example, if a story is blocked by another story, you can, and it has an option also. So let's see, for example, if I open this story and if I do link issue, then it tells me what are the options. So you can have a story which is blocking it, or this is blocking another story. And if this is blocking another story, automatically the other story will also get a linked issue, which is this, and it says that it's blocking. If it's cloned by, it's duplicated by, or relates to. So this is how you can manage your backlog of stories which are similar or related, right? And the last point is link a Confluence page. So Confluence is where mostly it's a parallel product, it's basically a documentation product, a wiki, which allows us to create documentation around a project. So best practice again is to keep the architecture of a certain story documented and linked to your stories. Oops. So that's what it is.
One question.
Yeah.
So should you be linking each story to a conference or an Epic ID to a conference?
Ideally, Epic ID is sufficient, and if you link an Epic to that should be sufficient for each story. You don't need to, but if you have a certain let's say workflow that is relevant to a particular story, you can always link that as well to a story. So but yeah, I mean it's generally sufficient to have a Epic linked to, and you can even make that as a part of your process, that every Epic should have an architecture document accompanying it. It's good practice.
Now, in terms of when you assign the version to stories, you drag all of these versions and like drag and drop. So all the stories have now same version. Now essentially stories, they belong to an epic. So can I drag an epic into a version?
Yeah, Jira I think doesn't allow that. I tried that. But if you drag an epic to a version, that would be pretty good. But what could happen is like, yeah, I mean, I think it doesn't allow you to just drag an epic and assign all the. I tried it, but maybe.
I'm just asking because
that would have, I also thought about that. Actually, that would have been a good feature where you can
complete.
complete.
It also looks like a story.
Yeah.
But then maybe they've not given a feature because not everything would have to be released in that particular version.
Yeah, but it would have been nice to do that anyway, right? I mean, people have to have the option, so it's just an additional feature. But
Okay. That's what we did already, right?
No, so I mean, bulk action is already there.
Yeah.
I think it's closed, no? So just I was trying to be too smart. Slide the screens and it didn't really support. Trying to go fast. Okay. So actually, we can try that also. Towards the end of the session. It's running a bit behind now. So yeah, so that was the last slide we were at. So link confluence page, that's something you should ideally do for an epic, maybe for a story if required. This is an epic. This is how an epic looks like. So effectively in Jira, epic is also a story type. It's an issue type, right? It just has special significance in terms of that, as you saw in the view, it appears on the left as a filter. So which I'll just tell you. So like if you see here, it shows epics as a filter here. That's the only thing. Otherwise, Jira treats it as an issue. So what are the key fields or aspects of an epic? So you have the summary. Now the interesting bit is that the epic's name appears here and the summary appears there. I don't know how many of you have actually noticed this, but yeah, that's slightly confusing, but it's good to know that the summary will always appear there, so you accordingly write what you need to write as a name. Or issues in the epic automatically get populated here. So again, link confluence page, it's more important relatively, and then you have this. So a version, when you click on a particular version, this is how the screen looks like. You typically have a version name with the start and release date. So, and then you have the issues that are in that version. And then you have a release button when you're ready to release it. So we'll just look at this again quickly here. So when you look at, for instance, so we saw that was empty, but now when you probably open this in a separate. But now when you look at this epic, you can see the list of issues that got assigned to this epic. So you can see the issues automatically appear here, and then they also appear for the version. Let's try dragging this on. Let's see if this works. Yeah, it doesn't. So maybe it doesn't allow you to do that. So and this is now, since we added these 3 issues, so you can see there are 3 issues in the version, 0 issues. So it keeps tracking. This is what keeps tracking the progress. You know how many days are left. So in this view, business stakeholders can also see how far are we in terms of our progress. Okay. Now gets to the exciting bit, right? So progressing. So we've set up our backlog. We've defined epics. We've got stories. We've got versions. We've defined certain releases, but life doesn't go as per plan. Okay. So we've got we've got our backlog of stories. We define we're starting activity, very ambitious. We're going to have 2 epics, one with a story and a task, just using the color codes that we use. So and maybe an epic with 3 stories that we're going to start working on, right? So that's for sprint 1. Day 1 we start working, and we'll see how this works in Jira. But for now, just like for Gautami and you, so you kind of can visualize what happens, right? So you have a set of work that will start, and sprint 1 starts day 1. Everything looks good. We start working. We've got a few stories that we started working on. One looks like won't get done. We've got a few bugs emerging. So day 3, the backlog is building up, looking. We've got day 5, last day, death march. Got a few things accepted, but still got left with a few stories which didn't complete, and there are a few bugs that we need to fix, right? So now this is going to carry forward to the next sprint. So sprints are basically 1 to 2 week cycles within which we take a certain set of stories and we try to complete them. So that's what a sprint is, right? So this is a 1 week sprint that we're looking at, and then we decide our next sprint. So in the next sprint, what all is going to go? So we take a few which were left from the previous sprint. We add on some from our backlog, and then we reduce the backlog down. Right? And that's how the development process goes. Right? Not discussing Scrum meetings or things like that; those are for later. But this is effectively what a lot of us have experienced. Right? Now, how do we set up our board to reflect that in the best possible manner? Right? That's the key part. So all of us are familiar with boards. For people who haven't seen it, let me show it to you. So a Jira board, typically, let me just, okay, maybe I'm not just being recorded, but a board looks like, well, actually, you know what, a board is comprised of backlog and active sprints. So even the backlog is effectively part of a board. So in the backlog, you can see there are a few stories. When we actually take them into a sprint and we start a sprint, they appear in the active sprint. Right now, there are no stories that we started working on. We are just putting together the backlog of stories. So therefore, you don't see any. But this is how we have set up our board to look like. So we have a to-do, in progress, done. These are 3 states that we are going to track. But what if we wanted to change that? What if we wanted this board to be different and we wanted to configure that? How do we do that? So there is a button here called board settings. So we can go to board settings, and this is what we are going to dissect here and understand a bit more about what each of these sections are, and then we'll try and do a quick practical session to set it up. So I'll take you through the key sections here. So as you saw, we had 3 states: to do, in progress, and done. And these are not the statuses in the workflow, just to be clear, right? These are not the statuses in the workflow that we discussed in the last. These are our columns. So that's what we're looking at, column management. These are the columns on the board. So we can have more, we actually cannot have more columns than statuses, but I'll tell you why. But if you wanted to create more columns, we could create columns, but we need at least, so we create columns, and then we map the statuses that we created in the workflows from the previous sessions into these specific columns, right? So these are the columns. Each columns have a name. Then you can add a status or add a column. When you add a column, it will create another column, and when you add a status, it will move it to unmapped statuses. And this is what it relates to our workflow, the statuses in the workflow. Now what you see here is set resolution. If you remember from the workflow, post function, it sets to resolution. So this actually affects that post function. So when something transitions to this state, it will set the resolution as done. Okay, so that's how you can basically manage. And then other things that you want to be familiar with is swim lane. So swim lane allows you to create, so these are columns. Swim lane allows you to basically create your sort of horizontal groupings also. You can create swim lanes by stories, by different aspects. We'll see that. Maybe actually it's best to go through these now as one by one we discuss them. So this was our board settings. So we saw this. Now what I'm going to do is in project settings, we'll see that our workflow, how does it look? So we'll be able to relate the workflow to the columns. Okay. So this is our simple workflow that we're using. All issues can go to do, all issues can go to done, all issues can go to in progress. Now, last time we learned how to create a workflow from the workflow tab, but let's say we add a new status here and we call it bugs reported, right? So there's already a existing status, we'll probably use that and we add that. Now as you see, it comes to unmapped status. And we create a new column which says bugs. If you create a column, it comes here, right? This also ended up creating a new status somehow. Add another column out of bugs, right? So it's already creating new statuses. So that's something new for me as well. But now when we look at, so we've got new statuses that we have created. What you can do is you can remove certain statuses here. So you can even manage statuses from within this screen. And what happens in your workflow as a result, you'll see is, if I just refresh this page, you'll see that the changes are actually coming into your workflow, right? So it's actually affecting your workflow. Now, if I delete these statuses, now can somebody tell me, is this kind of a setup possible? What we've done here now. We've got 4 statuses that we have created, and this is our workflow. If I look at this again, so we've got 4 statuses, and every issue can move into any status, and we have 5 columns. Actually, maybe table say empty. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So maybe the question was slightly early. So what we do is we map statuses to columns, right? So you can have even 2 statuses in a single column, or you can have a status for each column, right? So let's say we have this, and we delete this. So we've got these 4 columns. Let's say we added another status, which says thinking about it. Okay, and we add this. So what we do is we add this status also to the to do column. Okay. What will that do to the board is, and if you're able to see this in the board, maybe you do see it after you start this one. So basically you'll be able to see when you move a issue, it will ask you which one do you want to move it to, which status do you want to move it to. So you can have multiple statuses within a column which classify what within to do are you really looking at, right? Or what status are you at. Those are the kind of things you can do, and we'll see when we start the sprint how that happens. Um, and as you can see here, again, the workflow keeps on adjusting itself based on the statuses that you create. So thinking about it comes up. Okay. So
One question. So when I'm updating the status of a ticket, the stories or tasks, they automatically move into their
respective columns.
If I'm creating a column with no status,
Yeah, so let's try doing that.
And what else?
So let's try doing that. So let's go to board settings. Can anybody guess what will happen?
Disappear maybe?
Um, I'm guessing. Till we see it. So yeah, let's say it's like this, right? So
So this bugs is not a status, right? It's just
it's a column, yeah.
It's a
Yeah, you can
nature
call
of
it something else. That's just a column on the board, which allows you to just move to track where.
Yeah, so why it's it with to do and done and progress?
We're just taking it as an example.
Yeah, but it should not be with to do and in progress and done. It's not the same as in progress and done and to do, because bugs is the nature of that ticket.
I mean, you can call it something else. What do you want to call it?
Yeah, bugs, story,
Okay, whatever.
okay,
Something.
task, subtask.
Something.
Yeah,
I mean,
You can
this is
put
just the
review
name of the
maybe.
column. You
I
can
think
Code
code
review.
review, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah,
right, and you review.
in review or in deployment.
Whatever. That's fine. It's a session. It's not an active project. Okay, in Unity, right? So as much Mustafa was worried about this, let's see what happens when we actually go to the, because it didn't have a mapped status on suspense over. It disappeared, right? Because it doesn't have any status, so it doesn't do anything, right? So you won't have a column appear here. Okay. So yeah, I think we covered most of the column setup. So column and status mapping, everyone's clear about this. This is the key message in this session to understand how we set up our boards, and now you can play around with it and set it up as per your own comfort. So once this is set up, once our board is set up and we're ready to go, then let's actually create a sprint and start our work, right? So we've got 3 stories we've created. I thought we'll create a new story, but I think we'll skip that. Let's say we have these 3 stories that we've put together for this epic, and this is going to be released in MVP version. That's all we'll do in this product. So we start by creating a sprint, and creating a sprint is not starting a sprint. So creating a sprint is just creating a space where we plan our sprint. Okay. If you want, you can create more sprints, right? So let's say we want to plan 2 weeks of work. So you can have sprint 2 as well, sprint 2, sprint 3. So our sprints last a week, as we have agreed in this case. So we can have, now let's say we pick up 2 stories. So you can drag a story just simply from your backlog, move it to sprint 1. You can move this to also sprint 1, and then you can plan this for sprint 2. Okay. That's how we set up our board. And now, but we can only start one sprint, right? So we'll start the sprint. Right now you can see the active sprint still looks empty because we haven't started the sprint. So we're going to start our sprint. It's Monday morning, and we're committing to complete these 2 stories. So we say start sprint. It'll ask you how many weeks. We'll do it for a week. Start date, end date, automatically end date will sort of come up. It's always good practice to write a sprint goal. A sprint is generally where you're trying to pick stories also in a coherent manner so that you're achieving a potentially shippable product at the end of the sprint. So ideally, every sprint you should be doing something where you can release something to customers and stakeholders. So that's why the sprint goal field is useful. It's not mandatory, but I highly recommend. So this also gives you an alignment on what are we really trying to achieve by end of the week. So we'll start the sprint. And now you see the cards appear on the board, right? Now, when I move this, I can move this to in progress, and I can move this back. Now you see those 2 sections that we created. Two statuses mapped to a single column. So I can either put it in thinking about it, or I can move it to do. That's just not reflected now. So that's how you start sort of working towards your story. Then, and again, the workflow governs this from the previous session. What you can move from which status to which status, the transitions. Yeah. Let's say now we had a Wednesday, we're sort of working on this. We add comments to these stories and cards. That's how we collaborate on the story. And then finally, once we move to done, then you see this strike off. And why did this strike off come here? Yes. So we got this resolution here and the transition done. Okay. Cool. Okay. So back to our board. So we've got this complete. Now this is, let's say, in progress. This is the final state on Friday. So we've got one story still left out, one story done. What do? We're done. We've got 4 days remaining, but technically we completed. So let's say we do complete a sprint. When you click complete sprint, then you're asked whether you want to move the stories to the next sprint or to the backlog or to a new sprint. Right? So we'll move it to the next sprint and we complete the sprint. So what that does, it gives us a report, which we'll come to in our subsequent sessions on how to read reports. But it gives us a status summary also of what issues were completed, what were not completed. And let's go back to our project and see how the backlog looks like now. You will see that the issue that got completed is disappeared from your backlog. Okay. Now we have these two issues which are now in sprint 2. As you remember, we moved it to sprint 2. Now when we start this sprint, we'll again start the process, and that's how we keep sort of. And finally, when all of these are done, then we release the release. Okay, so that's basically how at a high level things work. Now I think what I would suggest is in board settings, I'll just take you through a few other sections which are important. So base swim lanes. So you can base swim lanes on epics, stories, projects. So these are the different categories on the basis of which you can create swim lanes. What this does is, this is there isn't enough, aren't enough stories here. But what this will do is in the active sprint. Let's say I start the sprint. One week start. So you'll see that it groups by the epic, right? So we said it. So if you had more epics, then the epic name would appear here, and you could see the stories of that epic here. So you can move stories, and they'll stay grouped by epics. So you could also group by assignee. So for example, if you just want to look at this for Yogesh, right? You could have this grouping by assignee, and then you can only see the stories that you are moving around the backlog. So that's another nifty feature you can use to set up. The other things. So that's swim lanes. Filters we'll come to later. So you can assign a color based on priority issue types. So you just get a line, an edge. Sometimes you see it based on the color. So if I do it by issue types, then you can see the color. So I'll just keep the reference open here. You'll see that all the cards have an edge, green edge, because they're all stories. So they're red because red was stories. Sorry, yeah. So we can change that, of course. The screen script. So estimation also will come to later, and then the issue details view. So this is all the. So this is basically if you're looking at the issue details by clicking on a specific issue, then you can specify what fields you want to look at in these. So that's something you can configure, and this also relates to the field configuration scheme. So yeah, so that's the key aspects about setting up your board. And I thought I will probably cover this as this thing, but we as a sort of step-by-step process from workflows. But we've covered everything. So we did a sprint planning. We ran a day-by-day sprint, and we completed a sprint. So you could see how the stories sort of work through. We also set up a board with mapped statuses, and we saw the various scenarios how they responded. What I'd like you to explore from here. So this is the gist. This is the basics, the essentials that you need to know about how to set up the board, how to run your sprints, how to move a story across the board and get through in the sprints. Do and explore smart commits. So this, whenever you're doing development activity, you can actually add your story ID to your commits, and that automatically starts showing up in your story. So it shows which commits are linked to which story. You can also move the story using your commit IDs, by the way. So you've got, that's what they're called, smart commits. So you never need to go to Jira as an engineer. You can just keep typing commands and it'll keep moving stories across the different columns as well. So it allows you to do that. You can create multiple boards. So what we saw was just one board. You can have different boards depending on how you classify your products. Integrating tests with Zephyr, this has been done by the Coco team quite well. I'd encourage them to take a session on how the test cycles work. So for someone who wants to understand how testing is very well, Zephyr is a tool which integrates with Jira and gives you a view of how the test cycles are run. So I would highly encourage at least people who've been involved in the QA team should definitely look at this. And also components and acceptance criteria. So these are these are add-ons, like these are not add-ons basically, they exist in Jira, so you can actually, for every story, you can attach components. So for example, if you're working on a large application which has a web app, a mobile app, maybe some IoT devices, so you can have components assigned to each story to understand which, that story touches on which components. So you can break down a web application also into different components if you want, and you can use that. And acceptance criteria is a sort of checklist. You can create your custom checklists. So each story in the right-hand view, when you look at the details, and you can create your own custom fields, which are which effectively appear somewhere on this right-hand section. So there can be a checklist. So just like you have these fields, you can have a checklist which says, or which lists out all the items that you should have completed before taking the story into delivery. So you can put your own checklists here. So like acceptance criteria is a sort of checklist that you generally use. So those are all great features from Jira that you can leverage to make your work smarter. And yeah, that's all. Cool. Questions? We went a bit overboard at the time. No. Yeah, a lot of you have actually worked on most of it, but I think the board aspect, setting up the board and making sure that you customize it to your advantage is key. So make sure you do that. Cool. All right. Thanks, guys. I didn't do that last time, I think.